You know, it's hard to ignore this feeling these days, isn't it? That
Yeah,
the world is just, well, tangled, really unpredictable.
definitely.
You see all these old conflicts, stuff you thought was history, suddenly making headlines again.
Yeah,
And if you're like me, you're probably sitting there wondering, okay, what's really going on underneath it all?
exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We've been looking at quite a bit of information, trying to get a handle on the big geopolitical currents, you know, and how they splash over into the economy.
And we're lucky because we're drawing on some pretty unique viewpoints here, including insights from Martin Armstrong and his sources, even some apparently within the World Economic Forum.
Right. So the mission for this deep dive really is to try and cut through all the noise, get a clearer picture of the big shifts happening globally, especially where geopolitics and the economy sort of collide.
Okay, let's unpack that. One of the first things that jumped out at me was this talk about the World Economic Forum itself, changes happening there, even talk of a coup against Klaus Schwab. That sounds like a pretty big deal.
Oh, it is. It's significant. Our sources are suggesting there has been a move against Schwab.
Mm.
And what's really telling is the attendance figures from their January meeting,
Oh yeah. What about them?
reportedly down,
Yeah.
maybe 20–25% lower. And for an outfit like the WEF, yeah, they relies on bringing those big names together.
And selling those expensive tickets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That dip in attendance, that's their lifeblood, financially and in terms of influence. It's a major red flag for them.
Right. So, okay, why the drop off? What do you think is behind it? Less interest.
Well, a big piece seems to be the public reaction, specifically to things like the "you'll own nothing and be happy" idea.
Ah, yeah, that one definitely caused some ripples.
It really did. It just hasn't landed well, has it? Lots of negative feedback.
You see pushback everywhere. So the thinking is the WEF might be trying to, what, distance itself from Schwab because he's become associated with these unpopular ideas, and it's hurting their brand, their bottom line.
That seems to be the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
That maybe by uh, jettisoning Schwab, as some put it, they hope to, I don't know, regain some lost ground, some influence.
Okay, stepping back a bit now, the whole global scene feels, well, shaky. Really volatile. You mentioned several hotspots in the Middle East, obviously Pakistan-India tensions, but also old rivalries inside Europe bubbling up again.
Absolutely. It really does feel like a kind of contagion, as some people are calling it. Old stuff,
Hmm.
old grudges that maybe were just simmering, suddenly boiling over all over the place.
Like,
Well, think about Bavaria in Germany, still commemorating wins against Prussia from ages ago. Or even within NATO, Greece and Turkey constantly sniping at each other. It just shows how long this stuff lasts, these historical memories.
and then, yeah, there's Ukraine. The level of hatred described there between Ukrainians and Russians, it sounds just incredibly deep.
It's extreme. I mean, the story about the employee from Kiev refusing even a layover in Moscow, that tells you something.
Wow.
Yeah. And apparently even just bringing Russian vodka into Kiev could get you a really hostile reaction.
That really complicates the picture we often get in the West, doesn't it? Which leads to this other point, the idea that maybe Russia doesn't even want all of Ukraine.
Right.
Because it would be so hard to govern the Western parts, the more nationalistic areas, different culture, different religion.
Precisely. And interestingly, from sources inside Russia, the criticism of Putin is often the opposite.
How so?
That he should have just gone in and taken the whole country quickly, like the U.S. did initially in Iraq.
Yeah.
But his stated goal, consistently, has been protecting Russians in Donbass and Crimea.
Right. The areas where reportedly there aren't many ethnic Ukrainians, and Crimea is mostly Russian-speaking,
Yeah.
plus the Mongol minority there, and the Donbass separatism, we hear maybe that kicked off after the Odessa massacre of Russians. That's not something you hear much about over here.
No, you don't. And that raises a really critical point about potential bias in Western media coverage, doesn't it? We
Absolutely.
really have to try and see multiple angles, question our own assumptions.
It's essential. And you add in the history, Kyiv's role in the Russian Empire, Khrushchev and Brezhnev having Ukrainian roots.
Yeah.
It gets very messy very quickly.
And what's fascinating, if you look even wider, is NATO's own internal stuff.
Yeah.
Memos apparently showing concern that all the focus on climate change funding might take away from military readiness, which seems to have sort of fed into this narrative of Russia being a big threat to Europe, even though, Russia arguably lacks the resources for that kind of invasion, and Putin's been there over 20 years without doing it.
So almost like creating a threat to stay relevant.
It has that feel sometimes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned historical grievances. I was actually called into the Yugoslav government right before it broke apart Those old wounds, they just don't go away easily.
Which kind of brings us to secession movements, right? The comparison with Alberta and Canada
Yeah,
feeling economically shafted, a bit like Croatia and Yugoslavia, cultural differences, even down to the flag. It shows these tensions aren't just elsewhere, they can happen anywhere.
exactly. And those polling numbers in Alberta, what, around 40% supposedly favoring separation? That's not insignificant.
No, it's not. But then there's this fascinating research you mention about how revolutions, separatist movements, they're usually driven by minorities,
Mm,
not majorities.
that's a really key insight. Think about it. The American Revolution, maybe 40% support, max.
Right.
Russian Revolution, Chinese Cultural Revolution, even the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, really dedicated minorities driving the change. Maybe only 2% for civil rights, maximum
Well,
involvement.
this cooperation factor idea, 2 to the power of n, how a small focus group can punch way above its weight.
That's it. If you have a few highly coordinated people, their influence can just explode outwards. It's about collective action, being unified.
And they feed off each other, this
Yeah.
contagion effect.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. One success inspires another. Like maybe the American Revolution sparked things in France with the Bastille. Or you see links between things like Tiananmen Square and the fall of the Berlin Wall happening close together.
Okay, back to Ukraine specifically. Given that deep animosity you talked about, lasting peace seems, well, unlikely anytime soon.
It looks incredibly difficult.
And then you have these really serious allegations swirling around Zelensky, his past conduct, current actions.
Yeah, the claims are quite something. Potential involvement in a journalist's death, the alleged drug use, even old comedy skits that apparently mocked taking assets from Russians and Jews. It's a starkly different portrait than the usual one.
And the changing religious identity mentioned.
That's also raised eyebrows for some observers.
So the view of him as a puppet, that's a strong take reflecting that perspective. And the outlook is basically grim. Stalemate unless Kiev essentially gives up the Donbass.
That seems to be the assessment from these sources, yes. The hatred runs so deep, finding common ground just looks incredibly hard right now.
Okay, zooming out again. Global conflict map. Are there any spots that might be, I don't know, safer? Less likely to get pulled into a major war? South America was mentioned.
That's one possibility raised, yeah.
Hmm.
But the bigger worry is this interconnectedness, this risk of a wider global conflict.
Which makes those reports about discussions near Trump, about the U.S. maybe needing to leave NATO, quite alarming.
It is concerning, especially the fear of some kind of false flag to trigger Article 5.
And hearing that Jamie Dimon apparently agrees the U.S. should think about getting out of NATO, that's surprising.
It really makes you question NATO's role now, doesn't it? Its original purpose, countering the Warsaw Pact, that's gone. And the argument persists that Russia just doesn't have the resources or, frankly, the interest to invade Europe.
It's such a different narrative than the mainstream one, and the comparison to World War I starting from the Balkans, a good reminder of how things can spiral.
It is. And the Yugoslavia analogy for Ukraine, breaking up along ethnic lines, it feels disturbingly relevant.
Yeah. If you took some of Zelensky's policies on language or religion in Donbass and tried them in, say, Canada with Quebec or the U.S. with Spanish speakers.
You'd likely have civil unrest, maybe civil war. Exactly.
So the accusation is pretty blunt then.
Yeah.
This is a NATO-driven territorial grab, pointing fingers at people like Victoria Nuland, McCain at Medan.
It highlights the completely opposing views on how this all started. And you hear these accounts of neocons who apparently just have this visceral hatred for Russia, maybe held over from the Cold War.
It's fascinating, like Robert McNamara apologizing after the fact about Vietnam, admitting they were wrong about Russian involvement,
Right.
and Reagan wanting to talk to Gorbachev even when his own people distrusted the Russians deeply, shows different paths were possible.
It does. And you look at some of the language used against Russia today by politicians. It's pretty extreme, stuff that would probably be called hate speech in any other context.
It's like the Estonian leader calling for Russia to be broken up.
Yeah, that's a very provocative stance.
Yeah. Okay, let's pivot slightly. We had a listener question that ties into all this uncertainty. Gold. We saw it rally hard, but then a bit of a sell-off recently. What's your take on gold right now?
Well, the first thing, and it's crucial, is to ditch the idea that gold rises with inflation. It's a common myth, but the history just doesn't bear it out.
Really? How so?
Look at 1980. Gold peaked then. Afterwards, it went down for 19 years. 19. Even while debt was rising, inflation was happening.
Wow, okay. So if not inflation, what does move gold?
Geopolitics, uncertainty, risk. Think back to the 70s, Bretton Woods collapse, the OPEC crisis hit. That uncertainty was a factor.
Right.
When gold was legalized again for Americans in '75, yeah, it popped, and then it came back down when everyone didn't rush out to buy it immediately.
Yeah.
The real big spike.
Hmm.
1979, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, geopolitical shock.
Gotcha. So the recent big rally.
That was largely driven by the huge jump in geopolitical risk, especially after Russia got kicked out of SWIFT. That was a massive financial earthquake.
Okay.
And then tensions with China added fuel to the fire.
And central banks loading up on gold? Why are they doing that? Trying to make a quick buck?
No, it's not really about speculation for them. They're buying it as a neutral asset, something safe, tangible. When you've got all this geopolitical tension, threats flying around about U.S. debt held by China, stuff like that. Remember, governments defaulting on debt. It happens. 1931, pretty much everyone defaulted except Romania.
So those AAA ratings on government bonds?
Yeah, AAA, yeah, right, as some might say. They're not risk-free.
And wealthy individuals moving money.
Seeing that too. Moving assets to places like the U.S., fearing capital controls if a bigger war breaks out. We saw the same thing back in World War I.
So this recent little dip in gold, maybe sign of hope, short-term peace vibes.
Could be, in the very short term. You have talks happening in Istanbul about Pakistan. Iran seems like it doesn't want a full-blown war right now. Maybe that eases things momentarily, but the bigger risks, they haven't gone away.
Let's talk Eurozone. There have always been questions about how it was put together, haven't there?
Oh, definitely. It had, well, fundamental design flaws right from the start. Yeah. The big promise was, okay, one currency, unified interest rates, no more exchange rate chaos.
Sounds good on paper.
Right. But the only way to really make that work would have been to consolidate all the national debts. One big Eurozone debt. That never happened. Each country kept its own debts.
Like a family sharing a bank account, but everyone has their own secret credit cards maxed out.
Kinda, yeah. And I actually warned about this back in '98. Said without unified debt, it's vulnerable.
And we saw that play out.
Absolutely. Greece, 2010, suddenly everyone panicked. Wait, if Greece could default, what about Spain, Italy, Portugal? It was like 1931 all over again, that fear of contagion.
And you make an important point distinguishing between, say, a stock market crash and a debt or housing crash.
Huge difference. Stock crash hurts investors, sure, but debt crashes, housing crashes, they hit everyone. Much broader economic pain, especially housing. It has this huge psychological impact on whether people feel confident enough to spend money.
We're also seeing bond yields climbing. What's pushing those up?
Mostly, it's war fears again. More perceived risk globally means investors want a higher interest rate to compensate them for holding onto bonds. It's a pretty straightforward risk-reward.
Historically, hasn't the Fed stepped in during wars to keep rates down?
They did. During World War II, Korean War, they were told to cap rates. But during Korea, they eventually pushed back, refused to keep doing it indefinitely.
And the Fed itself, its original purpose was quite different, wasn't it?
Completely different. It was set up to stop bank runs, basically. Be a lender of last resort, like J.P. Morgan did in the 1907 panic.
Right.
The idea was to buy corporate debt, commercial paper, to get money flowing, not primarily to fund the government. And it was regional, different branches, different rates, reflecting local conditions.
Until FDR changed things.
Yeah, 1935. That's when it got centralized in Washington, started moving towards one-size-fits-all monetary policy.
What about U.S.-China trade? Any sense of where things are heading there?
Well, one thing about negotiating with Asian countries culturally is the importance of saving face. Public fights, aggressive talk like we saw sometimes under Trump, that doesn't always work well.
So a different approach now.
The feeling is that, yes, there are probably quieter, less public talks happening now, more behind-the-scenes negotiation.
And just briefly, comparing Canada and Europe to the U.S., you mentioned some surprising things about Canada.
Yeah, people don't always realize, but Canada actually has significant trade barriers between provinces. Restrictions on things like lawyers practicing across provincial lines. It's not quite the free flow you might assume.
Huh. And Europe.
Similar issues there. Lots of protectionism. France protecting champagne,
Yeah.
Spain restricting cash usage, the ECB pushing for digital currency. It feels, to some, quite oppressive compared to the U.S.
And the dollar's reserve status.
A lot of that comes down to trust. The U.S. government doesn't just cancel paper money periodically, like you've seen in Europe or India or even Canada historically.
What about safety deposit boxes? You mentioned that.
Well, yeah, technically you're not supposed to hoard cash in U.S. safe deposit boxes because of money laundering rules. But the bigger point is the debt structure. U.S. has one national debt, states have their own ratings, Eurozone, separate national debts, huge contagion risk. The Euro design felt more about bureaucracy than solid economics. Even Helmut Kohl admitted later there wasn't real public support for it.
Okay, Circling right back to the start, the World Economic Forum. These reports of a coup against Schwab seem real then, and something about the new leader's appearance.
The appearance detail is, well, interesting, but maybe secondary. The main thing is, yes, the leadership change seems to be happening, but the feeling among observers is it might just be the same old playbook.
Same bullshit, different face.
Pretty much, yeah. The real driver seems to be that loss of influence, the falling attendance we talked about.
Their business model is selling that access, that influence, via the expensive ticket.
Exactly. And there's some history there, you know. My World Economic Conference started in '85. Schwab's Davos came later, '87. Always a bit of rivalry.
And his Great Reset.
Some see that as just repackaging ideas that were already out there, like debt for equity swaps, but giving it this negative spin, you'll own nothing and be happy.
Yeah.
Sounds suspiciously like cover for governments planning to default on their debts, doesn't it?
Mm.
Plus, Schwab's past associations, reportedly having a bust of Lenin, raises questions about the underlying ideology.
Yeah.
The sense is the elite are kind of moving on from the WE because it's gotten such bad press.
It's praising lockdowns.
Yeah, things like that just seem totally out of step. And fundamentally, a lot of the academics around WE come from this sort of Marxist equality perspective that ignores, that the people have different talents, different drives. It undermines their credibility for a lot of people.
Okay, so wrapping this up. Key takeaways seem to be geopolitical tensions are high. They're tangled together, driving a lot of economic uncertainty. The WEF looks like it's losing steam. Ukraine is stuck in a really deep, bitter conflict. Gold's recent dip might hint at short-term peace hopes, but rising bond yields suggest longer-term worries are still very much there. The Eurozone's got those built-in problems, and the US dollar, despite everything, still looks like the main game in town.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given these patterns, historical cycles of conflict, economic stress on you, how might this all play out in the next few years? And what does that mean for how you understand what's happening, maybe even how you prepare?
Yeah, definitely food for thought. For much more detailed ongoing analysis on all this, you should definitely check out armstrongeconomics.com. Great resource, lots of open discussion there too.
Thanks for tuning in to this deep dive.